So I'm Michael Dale, Assistant Professor of Philosophy here at Hampden-Sydney, and we are very excited for our final speaker tonight. I think it should serve as a great cap for our week of conversation on civic virtue. Mr. Bruni has written influentially and prominently for the New York Times for the last 3 decades, including as an op-ed columnist and a White House correspondent. He's currently Eugene Patterson Professor of Practice at Duke University, and in 2024, he was awarded the North Carolina Award in Literature, which, if you didn't know, is the state's highest civilian honor. He is the author of 5 New York Times bestsellers, the most recent of which is his book, The Age of Grievance, which I imagine he might touch on tonight. In The Age of Grievance, he discusses the recent trend towards polarization in modern political discourse, something I think we've probably all noticed, and he charts a way out of it. So it's an honor to welcome our keynote speaker, Mr. Frank Bruni.
Thank you all so much for inviting me here, and I want to apologize in advance. I've been fighting a cold for 2 weeks. I think I've got the better of it, but if I have to take more water sips or coughing breaks than normal, I hope you'll forgive me for that. I'm really happy to be here. I want to wish Hampden-Sydney a happy 250th anniversary. But above all, I want to commend you for making this an occasion to think about civic virtue. I think your timing is fitting. I've been paying close attention to this country and its politics for about 4 decades now. I've interviewed a few presidents, more than a few presidential candidates, many governors, many members of Congress, and hundreds upon hundreds of concerned and sometimes unconcerned Americans. I've listened carefully to what they said, and I've thought long and hard about what it means. At no moment have I felt a greater need for a conversation about civic virtue. All around me, I see people with little faith in and little respect for our leaders, our institutions, our government, our very country. Our politics are broken. We're in what week of the shutdown now? And there's no end in sight, right? Unless something's happened in the news in the last couple hours. Tell me no, okay, well, one can hope. And I think both a root and a fruit of that is the political arena's failure much of the time to attract the best and the brightest among us, let alone the most virtuous. Maybe that's why I'm often asked when, if ever, a politician has surprised me in a good way. And what always comes to mind is my first encounter with Bob Kerrey. And I want to begin the evening with that story. Many of you in the audience are probably too young to recognize that name, so allow me a primer. Bob Kerrey grew up in Nebraska, attended college to become a pharmacist, enrolled in Navy officer training, and ended up serving as a Navy SEAL in the Vietnam War. While in combat, he was gravely injured and had the lower part of his right leg amputated. He received a Medal of Honor for his heroism. Many years later, he went into public service. That's the kind phrase for politics. He ran for office as a Democrat, still is a Democrat. In the mid-1980s, he served 1 term as the governor of Nebraska, after which he served 2 terms representing Nebraska in the United States Senate. During that time, in 1992, he ran for the presidency, losing the Democratic presidential nomination to Bill Clinton. That name I suspect you all recognize. I met Bob some 2 decades after his presidential run. He'd been out of politics for a long while, during which Nebraska turned a deep, deep shade of red. Bob moved to Manhattan, worked for several years as the president of the New School, an unconventional college with a decidedly progressive bent. Then in 2012, the Democratic Party persuaded him to make a bid to return to the Senate. Nebraska had an open Senate seat, and Bob was probably the only Democrat in America with any chance to win it. He agreed to try, but it was very, very rough going. Although he was a native son of Nebraska, Republicans there painted him as some carpetbagger who'd shown his true hippy-dippy colors by settling down in, gasp, Greenwich Village. He was a coastal elite now, a radical leftist. That was the rap. That's what Bob had to overcome. So when I heard from a Democratic activist I knew that Bob, in his regular remarks on the campaign trail in Nebraska, was talking about his support for gay marriage, I was stunned. This was before the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage nationwide. In red states like Nebraska, clear majorities of voters were against gay marriage. It made zero tactical sense for Bob Kerrey to be plugging gay marriage. Zero. I wanted to know why he'd made that choice, and I wanted to write about it. I hunted down his phone number. I called him. He agreed to an interview if I could meet him in Nebraska, where he was trying to spend as much time as possible. And he gave me the contact information for a campaign aide who, he said, could set the interview up. So far, so good. But that aide then told me that Bob had misspoken. Bob had no time. The campaign was so sorry. Thank you, Frank. Bye-bye. Something seemed off to me. I called Bob again. I asked him, can you really not find time for this? He was furious. He knew nothing about my being turned away. He said he was going to fix it, and so began this really crazy dance. Bob wanted to do the interview. His aides wanted to foil him. They were heating the polls. Bob was heating his conscience. Back and forth they went. Bob prevailed. I met him at a restaurant in Omaha, Nebraska. When I showed up, so did one of his campaign aides to chaperone. Bob angrily shooed the aide away, and for the next 2 hours, over several glasses of his favorite drink, tequila on ice, we talked about gay marriage. We went back to 1996 when President Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. It stated that marriage should be reserved for man and woman, and a majority of Senate Democrats, along with Senate Republicans, voted for it. Not Bob. Bob, from Nebraska, was in the minority of Democrats who voted against it. He told me that he had no special connection to the issue, no gay brother or sister or son or daughter or cousin. He had no special insight into gay rights. But blessing the union of two people who loved each other, who wanted to make a commitment to each other, who posed no threat to anybody else, that just seemed right to Bob. It seemed decent, fair. And whatever Bob's own confusions about the matter, whatever his own political self-interest, he wanted to defer to fairness and to decency. Why am I telling you this story? Not because I think Bob was on the right side of the issue, though I indeed believe that. Not because I romanticize political mavericks who dissent from party orthodoxy, though I do wish there were more of them. I tell you this story because I think that civic virtue, the ideal that Hampden-Sydney was founded on, is present in what Bob did in 1996 when he voted against his party, and what he did in the 2012 Senate race when he doubled down on his support for gay marriage and when he lost. I believe he was driven by civic virtue. He felt in his bones that in an enlightened society, in a sustainable and healthy democracy, he must temper his own interests. He must expand his own perspective. He must factor in others. Think less about me and more about we. How many of us think that way today? How many of us behave the way Bob Kerrey did? I'll be really blunt. I'm frightened about where we are. I'm frightened about where the United States of America is. And I say that not in any partisan vein. Sure, I voted Democratic more often than I voted Republican. There's no reason to disguise or be anything other than transparent about that. Yes, I have profound qualms with the actions of President Trump and members of his cabinet. Anyone who has read me in the New York Times knows that, so there's absolutely no reason to be coy about it. But my concern and my fear are larger than the current president, the current administration, the current battles that our two main political parties are waging against each other. My concern and my fear have to do with the very focus of this 250th anniversary symposium. I think we're losing any appreciation for civic virtue. And I don't mean the specific phrase civic virtue for which there's no single definition. Try to find civic virtue as such in Merriam-Webster's online dictionary, no results. Type it into the Encyclopedia Britannica search engine, and you're fed a word soup, though it's a very highfalutin word soup, so I guess it's more of a word bisque. But a few themes come through loud and clear. Civic virtue is about recognizing our obligations to society as much as its obligations to us. It's about tempering individual desire with recognition of the common good. And while those ideals go all the way back to Aristotle, they got especially pithy expression in perhaps the most famous lines from John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural address. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. What was he asking when he said that? He was asking that we spend as much time looking outward as inward, that we not obsess over me, my wants, my obstacles, my view, my do, to the exclusion of we. That we not do the kinds of things that we have been assiduously doing over recent years, when we've stoked our political disagreements into furious partisan warfare, transformed our party allegiances into binding tribal oaths, turned compromise and centrism into dirty words, and prevented sensible legislative solutions to pressing problems. That's not to mention the harrowing episodes of political violence that are connected to all of this. We must travel to a better place, one in which civic virtue isn't some musty relic from the past or some fantastical wish for the future. But we're swimming against currents that didn't exist when President Kennedy made his plea. Much about our modern world is rigged for this fracture and dysfunction. Much about it stacks the deck against civic virtue, starting with our media landscape, our information ecosystem. I want to talk a bit about that because it's what I know best. When I was in college, television news meant the evening newscasts of ABC, CBS, NBC, and to a lesser extent, depending on your market, maybe PBS. That was it. Those programs occupied a finite time block, sometimes a half hour, so their producers and anchors couldn't fixate on a given story or allow their viewers to fixate the way that Fox News and MSNBC and CNN can and do. The newscasts weren't narrowly aimed at discrete demographic groups, so they sought to be of general interest, providing a mix of topics to what they hoped was a mixed audience. And they were staffed, often robustly, by seasoned journalists who were familiar with certain standards and guidelines and thus acted as gatekeepers who ideally kept junk information and pure partisan advocacy at bay. All of that hardly added up to some news paradise. There was a profound lack of diversity in who produced and presented the news, and there was an almost monolithic determination of what the public did and didn't need to know. But Americans got vetted information of a cooler temperature, with less commentary, less punditry. Americans received and operated from a common set of facts which they could speak or spar about with a shared vocabulary. Contrast that to the situation in which Fox News found itself in late 2020, when its executives and its anchors realized that if they contradicted Donald Trump's claim that the election had been stolen from him, many of their viewers would simply flee to one of the smaller cable or internet news operations that would confirm that. So Fox News booked and showcased experts peddling theories that Fox News anchors and executives knew were hooey. And Fox News ended up having to pay Dominion Voting Systems, the maker of many voting machines, more than $775 million to settle a defamation lawsuit, by far the biggest settlement of its kind. Truth has become a marketplace lousy with merchants, and any barriers to entering that marketplace have been demolished by the all-permissive internet. Anybody with connectivity and a keypad can shout from the rooftops of cyberspace. Anybody can establish a presence on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X. The gatekeepers are gone because the gate itself is gone. Whom to listen to, whom to follow. We have a reflexive attraction to what assures us that we already have the world figured out. We have a tropism toward communities of the like-minded. The infinity of the internet indulges that. It can sate any niche desire, any boutique thinking. And once social media's algorithms kick in, serving us meals precisely like the ones for which we've demonstrated an appetite, there's even less chance we'll expand our taste buds. The internet isn't designed to give us right or left, conservative or liberal. It's designed to give us more of the same. So if we've been marinating in conservative outrage, we'll get a more concentrated marinade. Likewise, for liberal outrage. And social media runs on the fuel of anger. Max Fisher, the author of the 2022 book, The Chaos Machine, once explained that moral outrage is the most powerful form of content online, and that social media is, these are his words, a machine engineered to distort reality through the lens of tribal conflict and pull us toward extremes. The metabolism of social media, he added, demands that users rely on quick twitch social intuition over deliberative reason. Deliberative reason is the friend of civic virtue. Quick twitch social intuition is not. There are contemporary agents of division and enemies of civic virtue beyond social media. One that we don't fully recognize is an economy with gradations of service that have become ruthless sorting mechanisms. While we have long advertised our places in the pecking order with our homes, our cars, and our clothes, there are now extravagances, fringe benefits, and microclimates of exclusivity that didn't exist before. Think about air travel, that's the obvious one. To go through security, you can be in a long, slow line, in a faster one for people who've paid for pre-check, or in the gilded corridor of clear. So it goes with boarding the plane, with overhead bins, with hotel check-ins upon your arrival. And all along the way, you have eyes on who has things easier than you do, and who has things even easier than they do. When I was growing up, school essentially came in two sizes, public and private. Now, private is the starting point with many costly but broadly applied add-ons, the tutors for special subjects, the separate tutor for standardized exams, the individual sports coach, the independent college admissions consultant. When I was growing up, you were posh if you belonged to a private gym versus, say, the YMCA. Now, there are all sorts of private gyms, and Planet Fitness and, say, Equinox are solar systems of pampering apart. And at some Equinoxes, different clients pay significantly different sums for personal trainers in accordance with that muscle whisperer's gradation of expertise. Those clients can also pay a surcharge for a better locker room. And none of that is unnoticed by or unnoticeable to the other customers. Its noticeableness is perhaps the point. Aspiration and perspiration go together. When I was growing up and went to the concerts of major performers, different sections of seating had different prices, but they fell into just 3 or 4 general categories. Your proximity to the stage often had less to do with your financial reserves than with how quickly and heroically you'd acted to get tickets. I once showed up at the box office of what was then called the Hartford Civic Center at 3 in the morning in pitch darkness to be in place when tickets for a Queen concert went on sale several hours later. That was the surest path to the best seat, and my friends and I ended up in the 8th row. But the seating maps for Taylor Swift's Eras tour revealed scores and scores of prices tailored with extreme specificity to the precise desirability of the vantage point. Please forgive me, scratchy throat. The highest prices were many thousands of dollars above the lowest ones. A family of 4 posting social media photos of themselves among other ecstatic Swifties was in some cases announcing to the world its ability to drop $10,000 on one night's entertainment. That family epitomizes the way in which social media present a nonstop stream of braggart postcards from other people's lives. I knew this was going to catch up with me, I'm sorry. Just as there are new echelons of coddling, there are new portals and peepholes, and they present a warped view. On Facebook, on Instagram, somebody is always raising a glass of champagne at a wedding in the tropics while the sun is setting in a gorgeous mosaic of colors. Somebody just bought the most amazing pair of impossible-to-find shoes. Somebody got a promotion. Somebody got into Yale. And it makes somebody else feel left out, resentful. That resentment grafts onto a new intensity of self-obsession, self-care, self-actualization, self-esteem. These heavy rotation hyphenates were relatively obscure a half-century ago, before the 1970s, which was famously dubbed the Me Decade in a 1976 cover story in New York Magazine by Tom Wolfe. In retrospect, Me Decade was a misnomer. Me Turning Point would have been more accurate because the period of time since has been a nonstop me jamboree. The problem with that, me marginalizes we. Individualism run amok can diminish public spiritedness. Indeed, attendance at religious services, engagement in other group activities, and active participation in our communities seem to be in perpetual decline. As the political scientist Robert Putnam noted in the title of his celebrated book about community breakdown, more and more of us are bowling alone. And we are pessimistic in a way that contradicts the very premise and promise of this country. American dream, American exceptionalism, land of opportunity, endless frontier, manifest destiny. I was reared on all of those phrases. There were supposed to be no limits in this land of plenty, which was always making more, better, bigger. We were inventors, explorers, trailblazers. Putting the first man on the moon wasn't just a matter of bragging rights, it was an act of self-definition, an affirmation of American identity. Obviously, that perspective was a romanticized, selective one. It minimized the degree to which many minority groups were shut out from all this inventing, exploring, and expanding. But the idea of the United States as an unrivaled engine of social mobility and generator of wealth held sway with many Americans who expected their children to do better than they'd done and their children's children to do even better. Not anymore. Polling in the past 5 years shows that most Americans do not think that their children will rise higher than they did. That's an enormous change not only in this country's mood, but in the country's very psyche. And it has been building for 2 decades now. Consider this. At least several times a year, beginning in 1979, the Gallup organization has polled Americans on the question of whether they are generally satisfied or dissatisfied with, quote, the way things are going in the United States. Up until 2004, the share of Americans who professed satisfaction routinely exceeded 50% and even 60%. But since January 2004, it has never even reached 50%. Not once. It has spent most of the past 5 years below 30%. Last month, it was 29%. So for more than 2 decades, without exception, a minority of Americans, and often a small minority, have been content with our country's lot and with its prospects. That corrodes civic virtue. Why? If I feel good about my country's future, if I trust that its economy will grow, that its government will make progress, that its institutions will be just, I have one kind of relationship with the people around me. I see their good fortune in tandem with my own. But if I don't trust the pie to expand, and I don't trust the people slicing it, then your gain is my loss. Your advantage is my obstacle. Our relationship is no longer collaborative, it's competitive. I stop thinking about we, I promote and I protect me. But we can try to change that, to rediscover and encourage civic virtue. I'll mention some small measures, and they are small measures, but done in concert, I think they could have a big effect. Let's start with the media. I work for one of the most influential, wide-reaching news organizations in the world, the New York Times, and the overwhelming majority of our audience is online. That fact, coupled with advances in technology, means that the Times knows exactly what that audience is doing. I don't mean in a nanny cam way. The Times isn't surveilling each of us individually, but it knows how many people click on a given story, how many minutes on average they stay with it, what percentage of them came to it from a Google search versus a social media post versus the homepage. Decades ago, We had to make guesses about what readers were doing based on such blunt instruments as surveys and focus groups. Not anymore. And because we're in part a commercial enterprise, we must and we do adjust to our audience's desires. In late 2016 and early 2017, after Donald Trump's first presidential victory, many Democratic acquaintances would ask me, would grill me, why did you all write so much about him? As if that were the culprit. I'd ask them, why did you all read so much about him? The Trump glut, in large part, reflected the Trump appetite among media consumers. If those consumers had been clicking as readily on the coverage of one of Trump's moderate challengers in the Republican primary, John Kasich, they would have quickly seen much more John Kasich content. My point is that more than ever, we're getting the news that we ask for, which means we have the power to get better news, less sensational, and less slanted. We can, as they say, vote with our feet. And we need to do that, each of us. We need to support and create a market for alternatives to ideologically driven websites and the like. And we need to encourage that behavior in younger people, in students, before they develop different bad habits. And that conversation must extend to their use of social media. We're already making progress on this front. My friend Jonathan Haidt's increasingly successful campaign, which is really at this point a movement to get smartphones out of classrooms, is about more than the distraction that those phones pose. It's about how those phones enable hour upon hour on social media, where young people, like everybody else, are ideologically sorted, economically manipulated, addled. I've been a professor at Duke for 4 years now. And at some point in almost every class, I ask students to talk about their social media feeds, as well as their broader media diets. I ask them to look honestly at how diverse, those are or aren't. And then I ask them if they set it up that way or if it just happened to them. Most of them realize that it indeed just happened to them, that it's not a real mirror of their intent, and that they are willing to tweak it. But they needed that moment of forced introspection. They needed that reminder. They needed that nudge. It should be coming long before college, and it should be coming from a variety of adults in their lives. Because of all the forces that are physically and politically sorting and isolating us, we need to emphasize, prioritize opportunities to interact with people who aren't our social, cultural, and political twins. Those opportunities exist, and they're the building blocks of civic virtue, the stepping stones to it. We should develop, fund, and implement a serious national service program of real scope. When Americans speak admiringly of what the US military did for this country in the past, they're referring not just to the battles it fought, the allies it supported, and the evil it deterred. They're referring to its creation of common purpose and common understanding among people drawn from all regions of the country and from all walks of life. Luckily, we haven't had to require military service of young Americans since the Vietnam War, and nobody wants a return of the draft. But we could incentivize other kinds of national service for young Americans as a way of recognizing how fractured the country has become, confronting the mistrust and misunderstandings that stem from that, and giving people of different backgrounds familiarity with one another in the context of a shared mission. That service might be the upkeep of public parks, or interventions with underprivileged children, or assistance to other Americans in need, or all of the above. It might guarantee student debt forgiveness. It might hold the promise of first crack at certain jobs once the service is completed. Different politicians have floated different proposals. Most haven't really put any muscle behind those proposals, but the idea of national service is still very much kicking around. Pete Buttigieg has mentioned it in several recent interviews. I'm aware of other politicians mulling ways to design such a program so that it might attract young Americans and it might become a kind of vogue. I don't think our Congress would ever make service compulsory, and I personally think compulsory would never fly or work. But it doesn't have to. There are other approaches. We can redesign and reinvest in public spaces. For all the time we spend online, the places we physically inhabit also determine what we know of one another, how we feel about one another, and how we wind up treating one another. Our neighborhoods, towns, cities, and metropolitan areas can encourage social connection or make it harder, narrow our worlds or broaden them. They can, in other words, be deserts or gardens of civic virtue. Eric Kleinenberg, a sociologist at New York University, has thought extensively about this. And in his 2018 book, Palaces for the People, he wrote, "Social infrastructure is the missing piece of the puzzle. Building places where all kinds of people can gather is the best way to repair the fractured societies we live in today." Think about it. Private businesses, restaurants, retailers, fitness clubs, sort the people who use them by income and cultural affinity. As I mentioned before, that's often their very business strategy. But the library doesn't do that, nor does the public park. And if it's a big public park straddling different neighborhoods, it's culturally and economically polyglot. Good public policy can include tax incentives for developers who spruce up urban plazas, rehabilitate public spaces, or create new ones as part of their development projects. It can open schoolyards for public use during evenings and on weekends, or make it easier for citizens to use existing public spaces for communal events. The importance of all of that traces back to a basic, indisputable truth that any social psychologist or political scientist will vouch for. It's easier to demonize people whom you don't know, who exist in caricature rather than flesh and blood. I see this in my work as a journalist. I see this in my inbox on a monthly and often weekly basis, as does just about every other opinion writer I know. I can't count the number of times I've received an angry, insulting, or even wildly abusive email from a reader, and after I've responded with relative cool, received an apology, often immediately. I was an abstraction to that reader until that point, and few people hesitate to attack an abstraction. But wait, I had manners, feelings, I was an actual human. That changed the interaction. I also can't count the number of times readers who've contacted me, to say that while they disagree with me about certain issues, or about the entirety of what they perceive my politics to be, they subscribe to my weekly newsletter and feel a warmth toward me because of the tenderness and love with which I write about my dog. They're dog people too, and hey, dog people are never all bad. Or they tell me that while I had too much respect for Barack Obama or too little for Hillary Clinton, I can be forgiven because I've admitted my flaws and vulnerabilities and shown guts and soulfulness in their eyes through candid autobiographical accounts of such matters as suffering a stroke 8 years ago and learning that I might go blind. It's in the details of our lives outside of politics that we become whole and comprehensible and valuable to other people. There's something additional that we should emphasize and prioritize and make more accessible, and that's a liberal arts education. And I'm not saying this just because it's what Hampden-Sydney, more than most other colleges in this country, values and promotes. I've been saying and writing this for years. A liberal arts education is one of the greatest inoculations against sorting, against narrowness, against blinders. It points us in the other direction, away from me and toward we. A liberal arts education is all about the bigness and the richness of whole civilizations. It's all about a larger context, a longer continuum. When you take a course in history, any course in history, what are you really learning? You're learning about the smallness and peculiarity of your own moment in time. But you're simultaneously learning how that moment connects to and fits into a much more varied tapestry, a much more complicated puzzle. You're being tugged outside of yourself and outside of the inevitably cinched parameters of your birth and your era. It's a lesson in perspective. So is a course in literature. A poem, a play, a novel is an exercise above all in empathy, in confronting and coming to understand what the world looks and feels like through eyes and a heart and a soul and a psychology other than your own. The study of a foreign language is the study of a way to communicate different from yours. The study of anthropology is the study of different ways of organizing societies. The study of science recognizes how layered the physical, chemical, and biological worlds are. It's a summons to wonder, and it's a summons to wonder about the complexity of the world. All of that nurtures a quality that's an enormous part of and a prerequisite for civic virtue, and that's humility. The men and women who on January 6, 2021, invaded and desecrated the US Capitol, assaulted law enforcement officers, and forced members of Congress to run and hide, they were delusional, they were frenzied, and they were savage. But above all, they were unhumble. They decided that they held the truth no matter the evidence to the contrary. They couldn't accept that their preference for one presidential candidate over another could possibly put them in the minority. Or perhaps a few of them just reasoned that if it did, then everybody else was too misguided to matter. They elevated how they viewed the world and what they wanted over tradition, institutional stability, law, order. And that is the polar opposite of civic virtue. I want to recommend one final gesture in favor of civic virtue that we can make. When we see politicians, when we see any public leaders who exhibit civic virtue, we need to extol them. We need to thank them. We need to reward them if that's possible. We need to show them and show anybody else who's watching that giving the public interest the same weight as private interest doesn't go unnoticed. I began my remarks by doing that in regard to a Democrat, and I want to conclude my remarks by doing that in regard to a Republican. Exactly 2 weeks from today, 2 weeks from tonight, I will be at another outstanding liberal arts school in the South, Wake Forest University, to interview Mitt Romney, who's beginning to make appearances at a few colleges around the country. Here's the brief primer on him. Mitt Romney was the governor of one of the country's most democratic states, Massachusetts, and then in 2012, he was the Republican Party's presidential nominee. He lost the general election to Barack Obama. His life is divided between Massachusetts and Utah, and in 2018, he ran for the US Senate from Utah. He won, and he took office in time to weigh in on the first impeachment of President Trump. He was the only Republican in the Senate to vote to convict Trump. Later, the January 6th rioting happened, and the House of Representatives impeached President Trump a second time. And for a second time, Romney voted to convict him. He was one of 7 Republicans in the Senate to do so that time. And Trump's supporters were livid. MAGA was livid. Mitt Romney found himself booed at his own party's gatherings. He confessed to feeling fear at rallies in Utah that were filled with members of the very party he represented. He felt compelled for the first time in his life to hire personal security for himself and his family, and he was always watching his back. How did Mitt Romney's dissident votes benefit him? I guess he got some great media coverage, but it's hard to see that as compensation for his grief. He was hailed by Trump's critics as a hero, but that didn't tee him up for a higher political office. The only real dividends for Mitt Romney must have been his belief that he'd done the right thing for the country, that the public good of his actions outweighed the personal cost. Again, how many of us do that? Not as many of us as should. And it's costing us dearly. We all see that and we all feel that. What we've somehow lost sight of is the confluence of our self-interest and the public interest. That's where civic virtue resides, and right now it's in our blind spot. Too few of us recognize that there can be nothing good for me if we fail. We're just losing entire sight of that. But I hope that institutions like Hampden-Sydney College and occasions like its 250th anniversary and this conversation about civic virtue will help change that. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop there to leave time for questions, and I appreciate your attention. And I apologize again for my voice. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you for that. Did everyone hear that question? Do you need me to repeat it or repeat it? I'm going to boil it down, and I'm not going to do justice to it, and I apologize for that. But given the fact that news media are following their own audiences, is there any way to kind of change that? Is there any incentive for them to do that differently? I don't know if there's an immediate incentive. There's an incentive in the sense of doing the right thing, you know, for the population, for democracy and all of that. I think that many news organizations try to balance the two. I know the New York Times best, but we continue to staff and run foreign bureaus around the globe. If you want to go look at any moment at the trending list on the New York Times website of the 13 most read stories at that moment or in the last 10 minutes, you're not going to see much foreign news. That foreign news is an economically losing proposition. But that's why they bought Wordle. That's why they digitized the entire recipe base. I'm mentioning that because one thing that news organizations with a conscience and with a sense of a higher purpose can do is they can try to kind of find creative ways and make calculations where they offset the things that do not immediately pay dividends by things that are maybe a little bit less important, but are important economic engines for the rest of the operation. I think the Times has been a leader in doing that. Those of you who read it can judge whether it's done it enough or well, but I think that could happen more often. But I want to kind of return to much of the onus is on us. I think we need to talk with everyone in our lives, and especially with younger people, because they'll be around a lot longer than us, about what it means to consume certain kinds of news versus other kind of news, about what kind of people they mean to be, and whether the media they're consuming reflects that and nurtures that. Because if those habits develop, if we try to develop those habits, and I almost said in the classroom, but this gets really politically charged in the school environment, and I think we're all too often outsourcing stuff we should be doing in homes to the classroom and letting ourselves off the hook. But if a new customer base exists, if there's an appetite for that, that is noticed, that is measured instantly, and it will turn things around. I think when my friend Barry Weiss started the Free Press, I think she meant to be doing this to some degree. The Free Press ended up kind of putting a lot of chips on anti-wokeness in a way that I don't think it's exactly what it set out to be. But she was trying to kind of test and create a market for something that was a little bit different, and I think more entrepreneurs need to do that. Thank you. I mean, your question to a great extent, but I mean, I don't know. I have hesitation when we talk about religion writ large. I think your question stems from it's an important and necessary question, and I know, like, in your mind as you're asking, I don't know your mind, but I'm guessing you're thinking about the white Christian nationalism that we see so prominent on the right. I mean, I remember being blown away one day to I forget who sent it to me, but to see that there was an entire reel right after the Department of Defense was renamed the Department of War, and it was Pete Hegseth reading the Lord's Prayer over a video montage of missiles being dropped and fighter planes going into space, and that felt to me like the kind of religion that's behind your question. I want, in my optimism and in my kind of generosity, to believe that that is not religion writ large and that is not religion as it manifests in most people's lives. But I am very concerned, and I think we should all be very concerned, about the degree to which a certain strain of Christianity motivates and is promoted in a political arena in a country that is supposed to have a division of church and state. Okay, all right, yeah. Well, I mean, I think of religion less as, I don't want to see churches become political organizing places, because I think it's sort of that what's good for the goose is good for the gander. But I do think that one of the reasons that as someone who's mostly a secular person, I'm concerned about the decline in religious worship and participation is I think a lot of people found in their religious communities a sense of there being things more important than just themselves, a sense of connection to a larger community and a higher mission, and a more proper apportionment of consideration of themselves with consideration of some sort of greater good. I don't know if I answered your question, but those are my rambling, adjacent thoughts. Yeah. I mean, fake news is ultimately an invasion of accountability, right? I mean, it's a really convenient thing you say to shut down the debate and to evade accountability. I don't know that we'll ever stop people. I mean, now that genie's out of the bottle, I don't know if there's a way of getting people to stop saying it whenever a set of inconvenient facts confronts them. But I think, and I do think that some of this has to happen in school. I think we need to be more cognizant about and to educate people better on what sort of news is reliable, on what sort of news is coming from a reasonably dispassionate place versus what sort of news is coming from an ideological enclave or ideological warriors. And if people understand better, if they are more sophisticated and better educated about how to evaluate the quality of the news they're getting, then I think they will hear the false cries of fake news more quickly than they do now. I mean, the only way to fight against fake news is to have people who are aware, educated, alert enough to be able to distinguish to when that is just an evasion of accountability and when that is something else. It's almost always an evasion of accountability because people who are trying to have a serious conversation are not trying to have that conversation in kind of schoolyard phrases like, I mean, fake news is sort of kissing cousins with "I know you are, but what am I?" You know. But that's one way, I think, in which we can try by trying to be and to educate and to rear more discerning, knowledgeable news consumers. Are you thinking of going into politics? No. So we start by you going into politics. I'm kidding. I mean, I think there's no one fix and none of this stuff is going to happen overnight. But part of what we do, and I don't mean to hark back to something I said earlier, but those people in the political arena who really do seem to be doing it for the right reasons, which doesn't mean they're following a given ideological or political script. It means they seem to be acting in a way that is motivated by doing something good for people around them and not just something good for themselves. I think we have to venerate and celebrate those people in a way that kind of makes what they're doing more attractive and makes clearer that it is the paradigm. And I think that will make an incremental difference. If the political arena is just seen as this sort of kind of circus of vanity and of traded insults and of all of that stuff, well, why would anybody virtuous go into it? But part of that is also our problem in the media. We write, you know, you could leave here tonight and do a search on how often, even a publication as high-minded as the New York Times, how often have we mentioned Marjorie Taylor Greene in the last 12 months, and then pick someone who seems like a kind of much more earnest public servant and look at how many times we mention that person. We in the media need to do a better job of that, but we as a society need to pause and venerate and celebrate and hold up people doing it the right way so that those who are thinking of doing it don't feel like they'll do it in a way that's, because even the most high-minded person wants some recognition, wants a sense that they're not going to be waging an entirely solo campaign, there's only so much self-effacement even the most honorable person will take on. We are to some degree at the mercy of the way the culture is moving, but I mean, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt. What's something we can do is what he's doing is policy work, essentially. I mean, he has built the motivation, that he's shown that the support is there so that school districts around the country are instituting policies regarding smartphones that they didn't have before. And that's in part because he has made the case so eloquently, and in making that case and in selling 1 million books, which I know was not his goal, he has demonstrated that there's a public receptiveness to it and there's an appetite for it. There are other things that can go on and that have gone on, but that sometimes fall by the wayside. Before Trump took office again, actually before he took office in the first time, there were many academics around the country who were working with, before Elon Musk bought Twitter, there were many academics around the country, including at my university, Duke, who were working with what was then Twitter, with Twitter's support, to kind of come up with alternative platforms where the content that would be surfaced, the content most likely to be viral, wouldn't be anger-driven, but would be driven in some other way. Just to develop them, put them out there, and see if the marketplace might embrace them. Now, if the marketplace didn't, the experiments would have surely ended there. I'm no Pollyanna, I know that. But there were some people at Duke, for example, who were designing something where the posts that would be surfaced and that would end up kind of trending on Twitter, what was then Twitter, and would be kind of foregrounded for you, would be those that attracted the most likes from the most diverse group of people, right? That's just one entrepreneurial vision and experiment. I'm sure it's still happening, but you need social media companies that will be interested in playing along. That could happen with a company like Meta, which doesn't seem quite as set in its ways as X, but Mark Zuckerberg is kind of hard to pin down where he is or where he's going to land. There's been a lot of movement there. But we can do things like that. It can happen with public research money. It can happen with private research money. And it can test new sorts of social media that might have a less destructive effect in the ways the current social media is having destructive effects. That's just one thing. How do we make education better? Essentially, yeah, that's above my pay grade and beyond my remit. I mean, obviously, we want a more, well, not I was going to say obviously we want a more educated populace, but I don't think all of us want a more educated populace. Obviously, we would be better served by a more educated populace. But I want to go back to the thing you said about civil discourse, and I want to kind of say something that's relevant to a number of the questions that have been asked, like in terms of more virtuous people going into public service in the public square. If you're looking for hope, right, and who among us is not looking for hope, and if you want signs that something better can sometimes fly and is sometimes accepted, a couple of years ago when I was kind of looking into this stuff, the three most popular governors in America were people who were in states that were one color and they were the other color politically, right? Larry Hogan in Maryland, Charlie Baker at the time in Massachusetts. And even though he wasn't in the most popular, not far behind, those are two Republicans in two of the bluest states in the country. And around that same time, not with approval ratings quite that high, but quite high, you had Andy Beshear, a Democrat in a very Republican state. I think I said country before I meant state. If we are so hopelessly polarized, and if we are so unable to muster civic virtue or have discourse that's civil, how did these three men transcend that? And I'll tell you how. In each case, because they couldn't be culture warriors, because they were from the party that was the minority in their state, they had to look at those issues, those concerns, those agenda items that spoke to the broadest number of people and were the least ideologically tainted. So if you looked at their governorships, you saw an emphasis on improving education, on economic opportunity, on fixing roads, that really kind of toned down the temperature and that ended up helping people in those states believe more in government. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania has very high approval ratings from his citizens. Usually, these things change over time, and never higher than after a major highway roadway collapsed, and he just kind of put every emphasis on getting that fixed so people could get to work. But he looked at something that said, I know we have a lot of divisions, but all of us want to get to our jobs. All of us want to travel safely. All of us want this. And that's where he kind of devoted his energy in a way that could bring people together as opposed to divide them. So there are people, even in this era, going into the public arena who are capable of that sort of calculation. It clearly has a market among Americans, among voters, because every person I just mentioned has been politically rewarded by voters and is in high esteem with voters. And the question is why that can't be scaled throughout the country, why the men I just mentioned, and there are women too, in that group. Laura Kelly in Kansas is a great example, popular Democratic governor in a red state. Why are they the exception and not the rule? And I think that's something we're all still puzzling over and trying to figure out. Yeah. I mean, so many ways, because we're basically talking about the kind of conversation that we should all be having with each other, and we're just kind of placing it in the home. But, I mentioned setting up your information universe, setting up your kind of intakes in a way that's intentional and that reflects who you want to be and how you want to be informed and what kind of society you want to live in. That's a conversation we should be having in the home, and we should be having it on a regular basis. We live in an era, to be really blunt and maybe a little controversial, where too often a child comes home and something bad has happened at school, and the immediate conversation is who needs to be punished? How were you wronged? It becomes a kind of conversation. It becomes a narrative, sometimes even of outright oppression, and it doesn't always need to go that quickly in that direction. This country has a very serious victim mentality. If you look at politics, look at how some of our most prominent and successful politicians, what they've used as currency and how they've campaigned, it's often by presenting themselves as victims come martyrs, right? And it kind of fetishizes this idea that you need to pause and take stock of all the ways in which the world has shortchanged you and all the ways in which what is going on in your life is not your fault, but the fault of forces larger than you. That is a conversation that I think happens in too many homes, and I do not think it is benefiting children, and I don't think it is benefiting the rest of us. It's a kind of thinking that I think needs to be challenged and tempered, because sometimes part of it is right, but I don't think that's happening in enough homes, and I don't think you can challenge that in a classroom with a teacher the way you can challenge it in a home with a trusted parent. Yeah. Yeah. Well, when you make, can I ask you a question? I mean, I don't know, have you voted yet, or I don't know your age, or, okay. When you certainly have politicians whom you admire and politicians whom you don't admire, right? When you're making sense of a political party or a politician, how driven are you by how perfectly they align with the precise way in which you want to see the world? And how driven are you, conversely, by whether you think what they're proposing and the way they behave might benefit the largest number of people? And that's appropriate, a balance. I think most people are not making that balance. And in fact, one of the most corrosive parts of our political conversation is the cheap and easy way, abetted by social media and all of its dynamics and problems, the cheapest and easiest way to get support from voters is to scare them about the alternative, not to convince them how good you are, but how bad the other side was. My kind of baptism into serious, sustained, deep political reporting was when the New York Times assigned me as the principal reporter covering George W. Bush's 2000 campaign. George W. Bush, a Republican. He had 3 phrases or slogans that he used most often during that campaign. And again, this is in the Republican Party. One was, I'm a uniter, not a divider. One was, I'm a compassionate conservative. And then the third, which was a dig at Bill Clinton and the whole Monica Lewinsky situation, was I'll restore honor and integrity to the Oval Office. But think about the first two. I'm a uniter, not a divider. I'm a compassionate conservative. Now think about the way Donald Trump campaigned for the presidency. I am your retribution. That is night and day. But an even better example that when I kind of paused and looked at it and blew my mind, and I know I'm wandering from your question, I apologize for that. Ron DeSantis, we now think of him as a failure because he wanted to be president. He wanted the 2024 Republican nomination, and he failed miserably at that, and Donald Trump got that nomination. But he's a very, very successful politician by any other measure. He's the second-term governor of Florida, one of the country's most populous states, and he won in by an almost historic, unprecedented margin in the general election that year. Ron DeSantis' signature phrase, his signature boast, is Florida is where woke goes to die. I have never in my lifetime known a politician of that altitude whose signature phrase included the word death or some variant of it in it. That is not some weird kind of quirk or asterisk. That says everything about who we are right now. And that is pan-partisan. I remember having lunch right after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. I was having lunch with a very prominent Democratic politician who is known, I'm not going to reveal gender, who is known for their moderation and their ability to reach across the aisle. And the subject of the Supreme Court's decision came up. And this politician said, well, the good news is now our voters will be really, really angry. And I understood what they meant by that, right, as a tactical matter. But I thought it's really kind of screwy that the main thing you want to instill in voters, that the smartest thing to instill in them if you want to turn them out in numbers and get them to vote for you with passion, is anger and fear and loathing. Because you can finish the sentence yourselves. If that's the mindset they're in, and then their candidate doesn't win, how are they ever going to be able to kind of come together with their opponents? How are they ever going to be able to see the politician who won as anything other than a mortal threat? I had the privilege, and some of you I see in the audience, I had the privilege of talking to some of you earlier today. And I think this came up in our chat, although if it was a conversation I had this morning with someone else, I apologize. My cold is, my thinking is pretty scrambled on a normal basis, and now it's really bad. But I mentioned George W. Bush, and what a lot of people remember about the 2000 election, and it did come up in my conversation with students, somebody asked about Bush v. Gore and the Supreme Court and that election and how that was decided. And I said, I'm really glad you brought it up, and I'm really glad you brought it up on a day when we're talking about civic virtue. because I was no fan at the time of Al Gore. Al Gore is a peculiar person, and I actually had a couple of interactions with him where he was quite unkind to me. Al Gore, when the Supreme Court in Bush v. Gore said, okay, we're halting the Florida recount, that's it, George Bush, which made George Bush the president. Al Gore could have said that is a corrupt, politically driven decision. He could have said, George W. Bush will be taking office as an illegitimate president. He did not. He made remarks saying some version of, while I am bitterly disappointed, it is time for us as a country to move on and to support our new president and get about the nation's business. That, hearing and remembering and thinking about that in the context of 2025, it's exotic. It's almost unthinkable. And if you want an example, a perfect example of civic virtue, Al Gore in 2020. And sorry I wandered so far from your question. From eating each other? How do you prevent cannibalism? Just wait, one small tip. I think you're watching too many zombie movies. Listen, I don't know. It's hard to. I don't want to kind of play into hackneyed notions. Like what my generation has saddled you with. And thanks a lot, boomers. But it is hard to answer questions like that because honestly, I don't want to give you some kind of Pollyanna fairy dust or pretend. This is a really perilous, consequential moment, and we've created a mess for you. And if you are super concerned and wondering what the future holds, that means you've got a really good head on your shoulders and you're thinking clearly. But now I will give you a hackneyed answer, but I also think it's really important. When the midterms come around, and in 2028 and in 2030, I want you to take serious inventory of and play a really kind of activist role in how many of your peers vote. You do not have the right, I don't mean you, your generation, I mean anybody, you do not have the right, and this is not aimed at your generation, but your generation does have really low voting behavior. None of us has the right to scream and cry about election results that we don't like if we have not bothered to vote. And so the one thing you can do that will be good, that will be a blow for morality, a blow for civic virtue, and absolutely good for the country, is to vote and to get as many people around you to vote as possible. Which again is a really hackneyed answer, but it's so important. We can't not repeat things just because they're unoriginal, Did you asked a question already? Are you allowed to ask a second one? I'm fine with it, but I just don't want to break Hampden-Sydney rules or something, But yeah, well, I'll just kind of expand on something I said earlier. We have an ability, and this cannot be overstated, but we have an ability today that did not exist this intensely 10 years ago, did not exist at all 25 years ago, to curate facts, to curate information, sometimes not really facts, to choose our own news in a way that did not exist before. Several publications actually, their jargon, many publications allow you to kind of, and when I say publications, I'm speaking really broadly and loosely, many are kind of very small blog-esque operations, whatever, but purveyors of all sizes, many of them have options where you can kind of tell them what you want more of and less of in various ways. You know, you can kind of create a profile for yourself, and they will then spit that at you. And the kind of, the nickname, the jargon for that kind of feature, which is very widespread right now, that kind of ability is the daily me, right? The daily me did not exist 25 years ago. And it meant that we couldn't marinate, we couldn't, you said they're getting only one kind of information. We can't shut down, nor would we want to shut down because we don't want to censor. We can't shut down the kinds of places that are purveying like bad, slanted, whatever. But you can decide as a human being, and you can encourage the people around you to decide, and you can try to kind of create a sort of, for lack of a better phrase, peer pressure and a sort of cultural conversation about making your daily me a really kind of heterodox thing. You know, I do it partly kind of for purely professional reasons, but I get newsletters from National Review. I get newsletters from several places that are to the right of center, in addition to reading the New York Times and the Washington Post. And I do it because I want to know what people are saying across the spectrum. I do it sometimes because I actually learn things that help me correct a misperception that's coming from the liberal media, which does have its own prejudices and its own blinders. And I also do it for a reason like, don't you want to understand the people who are making political decisions that are different from yours? It's really, really enlightening, and it's not necessarily consoling, but you'll often wonder, why is somebody, say, in the MAGAverse not as upset about X, Y, or Z as they should be? You should watch a couple of hours of Fox News, and you'll often find out that a story that has been like on the equivalent of the front page of the New York Times for 3 days running has never been mentioned on Fox News. I was talking to my sister-in-law the other day about the Bush administration's determination to give Argentina a $20 billion bailout. And I was kind of joking, what? I'm sorry, the Trump administration, that's the cold. And I was joking about how that just seemed like, you know, yeah, that's the epitome of America First. And my sister-in-law hopped on the internet, and she'd heard nothing about it. She's not a Fox News consumer, but she was just curious, and she went into the Fox News search engine. She couldn't find a single mention of it, a single story about it. I like to know that because if we're ever going to get to a better place, we need not to see the people who are voting differently from us, differently than we are. We need not to see them simply as kind of zealots or as people who are misguided. We need to understand that they're sometimes taking a much different set of information and a much different set of facts and making decisions that no longer seem so irrational if you think about what their inputs are. But individually, you have the agency, you have the ability to make sure that your intake is diverse. And you should encourage that in the people around you. It can't be forced on anyone. But I think more people than we realize want to behave and be different than what their current situation is. They're just not adequately motivated and prodded and enlightened about what's going on and how they can change it. You know, I'm not copping out. I don't know. I've read all the Mamdani stuff like you have. I feel like I don't really know him well enough now. To answer that question, I would have to know, does he really believe those things are possible? I don't know the answer to that. If he really believes those things are possible, I don't see anything about those proposals that are antithetical to civic virtue. If he believes they are impossible, and he is cynically and strategically mentioning them simply to get elected, and knows that they're pipe dreams and that he's going to end up with an embittered electorate, then no, he's not exhibiting civic virtue. But without being in his head and in his heart and knowing his motivations, I don't think it's an answerable question. Yeah. I would fly, and I don't know what Hampden-Sydney's distributional requirements are like. I hate to kind of introduce such a prosaic term, but I would design a college that insisted. And by the way, this is never going to happen because the marketplace rules in a way. But I would design a college that insisted that you take courses in a variety of disciplines. It is insane that you can graduate from college and not take 3 or 4 history courses. It is insane that you can graduate from college and not take a serious course in literature. And there are many colleges you can graduate from in that. And why? Because colleges, I mean, it's like the New York Times with Wordle and the recipe database. Everything is to some extent a commercial enterprise, and it needs to kind of heed and respond to the marketplace, or it's no longer in existence. I'm sure Columbia, for all of its kind of esteem and for its low acceptance rate, has lost students who didn't want to do the kind of 2-year program in the classics and civilization that it was requiring. But if I'm in some utopia and I can design the college, I make students learn broadly because we talk about sorting. Sorting happens in schools too. Like at a school like Duke, I teach in the humanities. I have students who've only met a handful of STEM majors in their 4 years at Duke because the tracks are so different. That's a crime. So I can't give you the exact curriculum, but I would be extraordinarily attentive to a curriculum along those lines. I would forbid you to choose a residential arrangement that was, I would not let students worried about climate change be able to choose a dorm wing that's just students who worry about climate change, and that sort of thing exists. I would not allow you to choose your roommate ahead of going. I'll tell you, I'm probably way over time, but I will tell you a story. When I went to Chapel Hill, I went to UNC Chapel Hill, and I came from a fairly secular family, and I knew before I graduated from high school that I was gay, and I had determined, even though it was a much different era than this one, that I was going to be completely honest and open from the moment I set foot at college, because I just did not want to wear I didn't want to wear a mask, and I didn't want to live in fear of someone not liking me if they learned something about me. I arrive at college, I arrive in my dorm room, I had just some cursory discussions with my roommate, and he'd gotten there first and he decorated the dorm room. And over in the main wall, huge poster, and it showed a loaf of bread and a chalice of wine, and it said, "Jesus invites you to a banquet in his honor." And I thought, this is going to be the longest year of my life. And you know what? We ended up being really good friends. He was extreme. He was a very devoted Christian. He was very involved in his church and immediately became involved in a church in Chapel Hill. But he liked me, and I liked him. I changed the way he thought about gay people. He changed the way I thought about religious people. And that sort of thing does not happen if you treat students like they're buying pairs of shoes at Nordstrom and let them choose everything for maximal comfort as opposed to for maximal challenge. I would do that too. Thank you. Thank you all very much.